Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Reading in my life is relaxation. You feel better afterwards.
Hello and welcome to episode 25 of Sundoku, the podcast for addicted readers everywhere. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Cath Keneally. Hi, Michaela.
Hello. What are you bringing us today, Cath?
Well, one of the guests at Adelaide Writers' Week this year was Adelaide author Shannon Burns, and I talked to him about his memoir, Childhood, a very disturbed, violent and unpredictable one.
Not easy to write a memoir when that's been your experience. What sort of approach did he take?
The book's laid out in a mix of styles. So there's some third-person narrative, and I think that covers his later childhood and adolescence where he just refers to himself as the boy. And some of it, especially the earlier, more emotive content, is related in first person. And we get a picture straight away of a really disturbingly interrupted and often violent but always unpredictable childhood.
And in just a moment, I'm going to bring you a book that takes a new look at Greek mythology, this time from the point of view of the females in the story. So we're talking about Jocasta and Pandora and Medusa and bringing those women's stories to the fore.
Yep, it's long overdue.
Well, what you'll find very interesting, I think, the book's called Pandora's Jar, but the very first story begins with Pandora, and it's not in the original script, it's not actually Pandora's box. It's a jar. So we'll talk about why a little later.
But first, Shannon Burns, his memoir is called simply Childhood, and the first part of that memoir is titled An Aberrant Beginning. Himself as a little 4-year-old, very much in love with his mother, but he's about to be separated from her and sent to live with near strangers, and it goes on in a downward spiral from there. Let's hear from Shannon, and he's reading an excerpt from that early part of the book.
He recalls little about himself before the age of 6. He possesses no photographs to jolt the hidden memories, and those few relatives he sees at birthday and Christmas celebrations have only the faintest sense of what he was like as a boy. No baby mementos, nothing of the toddler, no kindergarten tokens or preschool artworks, no school portraits or athletics medals, no locks of hair, first teeth, first boots, no record of first words or cherished toys, few revealing anecdotes. As he sits to write these lines, his inner archive is almost blank as well. There are only a handful of images left over, small, discontinuous fragments, which may or may not be authentic traces of an otherwise forgotten landscape. I awaken on a cold floor, head pressed against cement, blood dripping from my nose. I'm 4 or 5 years old. My mother beat me and left me here, so I drifted off. But now I hear other, friendly voices coming from the kitchen, or another world. I keep still, listen and wait. She has forgotten me. I am bleeding on the floor in a dark room. If this isn't a dream, if she's really my mother, if I'm still within her orbit, if the world I've woken up to is the same world I fell asleep in, she will come to check on me.
Okay, so you must have had that memory to possibly it had been repressed until you started doing all of this?
Well, that memory comes back later in the book, and so the first time I remember documenting that memory was when there was a question of whether I would be able to see my mother again, and the government worker, I think, is sort of asking about feeling around for some things that she might have done wrong, I think. And so that memory is summoned. And there is a question about exactly what it represents. So I talk about the fact that I had blood noses often as a kid. So it's very possible that there are, within that memory, there's a memory of being hit, but then also maybe a separate memory of having a blood nose and being left to lie on the bathroom floor, which is cool. And so I ask that question about that memory later in the book. Yeah, it's unclear to me.
Yeah. Fairly confronting for a reader to read that, and also you are fairly sure that your mother was very violent, not just to you, but to her parade of partners who turned up in your life.
Yes, she was unrestrained in many, many ways, and that was one of the ways. A kind of passionate violence. I do mark a kind of difference in types of violence that I experienced as a kid. And it might just be because of a boy's tender feelings for his mother. But I always felt that her violence, I understood it better than other people's violence. It was immediate. She didn't hold a grudge, so it was of the moment.
Plus it was counterbalanced with affection towards you.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Which was completely absent when you went to live with your father.
Yes, yeah. So in that context, there was a kind of grudging support for me. So they were much better at caring for me in a practical way, providing housing, basic food, clothes, making sure that I was going to school all the time. But there's a question about how you display, show, and mutually feel affection with people who are a bit alien to you, and with a child who's a bit alien to you.
Yeah.
And definitely never figured that out in that.
Plus you definitely had the wicked stepmother in spades.
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges that I had throughout. As someone who is wary of stereotypes, I lived through quite a few stereotypes. So I always have this kind of shifting feeling about them. Yeah, definitely wicked, but at the same time, she was there. And, what does it do to a person, I suppose? So my mother, maybe her way of avoiding being wicked was to send me away. To me, it's a question of how much people are able to handle, how much of their own lives they're able to handle, and then you add a child on top of it.
I think you say somewhere in the book that the world isn't full of good and bad people. It's full of broken and stunted people, and the people who've remained more or less intact.
Yeah, I think that I had a sense of that. When I was a kid, I had very forthright moral judgments, and much of it felt very unfair and almost kind of cosmic in its unfairness. That is a retrospective feeling. So I've moved between worlds since then. I've seen the different things that people are faced with and the different ways that they respond to it. So that's a mature voice probably looking over.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the trick of a book like this, when it's a good one, which this is to try and keep yourself in the mind of the child or resurrect it as best as you can and reimagine what's kind of settling into being your personality as a result of the things that are happening to you.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible perhaps to be sure about that, but there must be some things about your adult personality that you think, well, that's because I wasn't wanted by my parents. I wasn't wanted by my extended Greek family. I kept being bounced from pillar to post, you know. Certain things happen because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have, definitely as a young man, I would have rejected that. The young man needs to kind of assert his own primacy, the kind of, he is his own creation. But now, very aware of some personality traits, certainly some strengths and some weaknesses that are a product of that. And sometimes they're the same thing. I'm not anxious about it being excluded from things, you know, for example. And we inhabit a literary world, you know, where a lot of people are really anxious about whether they're included or excluded.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, maybe if you've been shipped off in these other ways, if you've been excluded from the things that you dearly, that you're very attached to, then these other forms of possible exclusion seem very minor to me. They're not very consequential. I deal with difficult things fairly capably. I can put in a good few years of a tough situation. I'm aware that I can get through it as long as I know that there's going to be an end point. Yeah, I think that probably has something to do with the childhood as well. So, but I'm also, as I said, I'm aware. I'm friendly enough, but I can withdraw, and there's a kind of connectedness that I'm pretty sure other people have, that I have with my kids and my wife, but not really beyond that. I struggle with friendships a little bit.
You didn't have practice at it.
Yeah,
you didn't have practice at it. And certainly through your teens, if we go back to the trajectory of your life there, again, it's pillar to post. You keep running away from your parents, at least your father and your stepmother. Eventually you shack up with a school friend and his mother, and that develops into something that was probably impossible for you to handle as well.
Yeah. So it became a romantic relationship, initially based on various kinds of common interests and sympathies.
Yeah.
Well, when you're a 15 and 16-year-old boy, I thought of myself as an adult at that age. So I'm living out of home and I'm not at school. I'm working. I feel quite independent. I've moved through life with that persona, and I feel at first that I'm sort of relatively in command of what's going on. But, you know, I don't have a place to live. I'm also isolated because I'm not at school. I don't really have friendships at work at this point. So she is my primary social world. And it becomes very complicated because she's passionate as well. I suppose a little bit like my mother.
Yeah.
So passionate and impulsive and deeply invested in a kind of romantic ideas. You know, this is forbidden love. And we inhabit that kind of almost novelistic thing, but you only need to kind of scratch a little bit of the surface off and see that it's not a healthy situation.
No. No, and indeed it doesn't last. And one of the things that I thought you showed up really brilliantly was the world of work that you were in from your early teen years. Your father and your stepmother were working sorting clothes for a charitable organisation, and you end up sorting waste.
Yes, yeah.
Than which there could be few more horrible jobs, and they're being done by desperate guys who are your social milieu, which that's fairly hard part of the book to read.
Yeah, I was very keen for that to be a significant part of the book, because you are the social waste as well, and you are kind of assigned this role, and almost from the moment that you're assigned that role, there's a sense that this is where you land, and to think otherwise is a kind of torture, because there aren't very many avenues. If you don't have the resources and you don't have the support behind you, there aren't very many avenues outside of that world. And it's difficult, not just physically difficult. I was one of many boys, really, who were working there, and boys with adult responsibilities, boys with families, some of them, with a partner and a young child who were the same age as me. And so trapped doubly. You're earning minimum wage, which is poverty wages. And there's no fulfillment in the work. You're exhausted at the end of each day, especially throughout summer when you're outside, it's really hot. So lots of days like that. And you get home at the end of each day and there's not much left of you. You're able to wash up, maybe prepare a meal.
Yeah. Work home, you say.
Yeah. And because you're earning such a small amount of money, there's not much of a social life either. So it's a big trap. I wanted that to be evident. So who is the audience for this book? It's probably not people with that experience. The people who read a book like this usually don't have that kind of experience. The other thing, is because it was from the age of 15 till my early 20s. Those are the longest years and the most socially consequential years of your life. Those are supposed to be the richest years as well. The years where, I suppose I did have the chance to make lots of mistakes, but they weren't the exciting mistakes that
No,
other
exactly.
people had.
And you describe several attempts at escape, and some of them are just simply running away. You run away from your father's home several times. You run back to your old neighbourhood, or you find your way back to your old neighbourhood, and then your parents come and get you. Which escape effort was the successful one? I mean, was there a road out that was the way?
I think it was around about the point that I stopped looking for an escape that it became possible, the point where I stopped being quite so desperate. So in my late teens, and certainly by the time I was 20, I'm still working in a recycling centre. The wage is better though, the wage goes up. I have friendships. I'm going out a lot. I'm meeting lots of people. I'm social. And I've found a way to sort of compartmentalize things. I'm physically confident. I've moved past the awkward teenage years. I'm aware that I have at least that value, that kind of physical value. And I'm having fun. And it was that fun, I think, that opened up the possibility for escape because I made new connection, and that eventually led to a different life.
Could I ask you to read another little bit, which follows on from what you're saying there about how you are always flirting with the idea of imaginary self-erasure, and one day he discovers, this part of the book is written in the third person, one day the boy discovers a solution to all of this wavering.
One day he discovers a solution to all of this wavering. At a particularly dire moment, when self-erasure seems like the only acceptable fate, he decides to pretend. What if, instead of erasing himself, he erases the parts of himself that cause the most anguish? What if he killed off the desire for a passionate love, a love that would make him whole? What if he killed off his dedication to sensitivity? What if he started to treat himself as a double, a second self who experiments with a different kind of personality, one who is not easily driven to despair? He tells himself, there is no need for an extreme act if you can erase this version of yourself and create another. So that's what he does. It is his secret, the hidden source of his growing capacity for risk and lightheartedness, a way of getting outside himself and seeing everything from a distance. He isn't betraying his authentic self by becoming another, he thinks, because his authentic self is dead. He couldn't thrive. There was no future for him. He had to be replaced. Whenever a severe bout of despair takes hold, the boy understands that the ghost of his former self is trying to re-inhabit his body, and he expels him again and again.
I loved that. That was very beautiful. And I liked that whole section that was in the third person. That had a particularly interesting effect
for me as a reader. And the thing we haven't talked about and we could perhaps finish with is what you talk about a lot in the book, books. Books are your salvation.
Yeah, absolutely. So books are a kind of flotation device. They're a kind of social world though as well. You know, there's something a bit sad about that. Very invested in the characters and closely watching them and imagining myself into various parts of it. So it probably wasn't great that I identified so strongly with Heathcliff, you know. And you know, there are lots of examples.
I don't know.
Or
I think you could get away with that.
Well, yeah, up to a point. And there are lots of questionable directions that literature can take you into. But then also there's just the focus and attention on language and the pleasures of language, the way that something can be shaped and these quite deep but mysterious things can be conveyed. The intimacy of reading, it always seems, and it still seems to me, to be quite an intimate relationship, not between the author as a person, but whatever figure emerges in the writing, and whatever figure emerges in you as you read the book. Other art forms were important to me as well, but they're not part of this book. I couldn't place them. But however, you know, I do wonder about my continued dependence on literary reading, because it can isolate me too. I'm too satisfied by my relationship to books. I should be prompted to make deeper relationships with other people, but I feel very connected to the books.
Listen, we understand that on this program. I mean, the book is always the important thing. Whatever you're doing, with other people or not, you put aside a book in order to be able to do it. The book is calling you back all the time.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And now you've written one, Shannon.
Yes, yeah.
Does that feel good? And do you feel as though you've packaged your life for yourself in a satisfaction, and maybe for your kids further down the track?
What I feel is that I've written a book that I needed to write in order to write other books.
There we are, Shannon Burns. For many years now, in fact, a very successful literary critic and university teacher. That's his book, Memoir, from Text Publishing. And he's an example of someone who has cobbled himself back together in a very successful fashion from having been broken by childhood damage.
It sounds like that book's really cleared something for him and he can move forward, which is lovely to hear.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to see what comes next.
Now, the next book that we're going to take a look at is Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes. This was written some years ago, but I've been lucky enough to have a chat with one of our favourite guests, Associate Professor Lisa Bennett, about the book.
Aha, so from Viking women to women in the Greek myths.
Exactly. Well, interestingly enough, this is one of the books that inspired Lisa Bennett with the writing of her book Viking Women. So we do cover that in the interview. What's so interesting, I think, for me about this is that, you know, Greek mythology, it's just it's some of the building blocks of our culture today, and you can you see evidence of it everywhere. But so many of those tales are either focused on the stories of men, or the women who are in them are really quite sort of grotesque, vengeful, evil,
monstrous.
They're pretty bad. And Natalie's a classicist, but she's a great storyteller as well. So she really brings these stories to life. And what she does is almost takes an archaeological approach. She goes back to all the evidence in history about these Greek myths, and she goes in search of the women at the heart of these stories. And we learn some very interesting things about them.
Natalie Haynes is an expert and enthusiast about Greek myths. So she knows more than probably anybody in the world. And she is most passionate about the depiction of women in the myths. And so in Pandora's Jar, she goes through over maybe around a dozen different female figures or groups of figures in terms of the Amazons, and explores how they were portrayed across various myths, not just the Greek myths. Her knowledge of plays, myths, Roman literature, archaeology, modern pop culture, she knows it all. But she starts off with the beginning and takes us all the way up to how some of these Greek myth women have been portrayed even in modern films. And right at the beginning of her book, she starts with a memory of being a kid and watching those classic films and how they inspired her, images of Medusa and things like that. So she takes us on this kind of voyage through mythology and explores, I guess, how a lot of these women have been hard done by over time, and that the vision that many of us have of them nowadays isn't necessarily the way that they were cast 2,000 years ago.
And is she saying that the stories we have now are wrong, or is she saying that they've always been that way, but she's putting a new frame on them? What is she doing?
I don't think that she's saying that they're wrong, but just pointing out how over thousands of years stories evolve. So the versions that we know may have been influenced, they have been influenced by Victorian ideals. So she takes us all the way back to some of the earliest sources, whether those sources are fragments of manuscripts, which she can read in the original language. She is amazing. I love the tone of this book because it is wonderfully conversational and funny, but also very smart. She's not afraid to, tell us the Greek words, but then also define them for us so that we can understand, the difference between Pandora's box and Pandora's jar, for example. So she's not saying that things have gone wrong, but that over time, manuscripts or looking at amphorae or jars or vases in museums have different images of these women, or plays have
Sophocles.
All of that. And she's got some favorites. I think Euripides is one of her favorites, so she keeps coming back to his work. And so she interprets how the women have appeared in various media over the centuries, the many centuries, and how now we have kind of understood them. Maybe I said the Victorians, but I think of people like, the pre-Raphaelite painters they're pervasive, the images of a lot of these women. And so that's the version that we know. So it's not that they're wrong. They just are putting their own kind of cultural moment stamp on the stories. And that has happened even back in ancient Greece. Different playwrights would put their own interpretation on some of the women. Looking at the table of contents, all the different characters that she covers, famous ones like Penelope, everybody interpreted her in different ways, even back in the day, back in ancient Greece. So yeah, I don't think that Natalie Haynes is intending to say this is wrong, but rather pointing out things that may have been forgotten over the years. So she's bringing them back into light and definitely interpreting and casting her own version of things or her view of things based on her wealth of knowledge, to give us the space to then reconsider all the evidence and go, maybe, someone like Eurydice is a little bit more empowered than we thought, or whatever.
Yeah. If we go back to the beginning, so the book starts with the beginning of one of the first female character in Greek mythology, which is Pandora. So we think that story is set in stone. We think it's all about Pandora and her box, and she opens it and unleashes chaos upon the world. Yeah. Why is the book then called Pandora's Jar?
So I guess this is the perfect story for her to begin with. Pandora's jar, in the original Greek myths and stories, she had a jar that wasn't necessarily filled with all the evils of the world that she loosed upon man. But in later versions, because of linguistic shifts, because of mistranslations, because of shifts in ideals, became the box with negative connotations that we know of nowadays. And she begins with an example of a painting by Edward Burne-Jones of, I'm sure many people can picture it, of this beautiful woman with almost a Grecian hairdo holding a box, and the lid is cracked a little bit and there's a kind of sinister wisp of something sneaking out of it. And I think that kind of image has imprinted on a lot of our memories or our understanding of, well, Pandora has a box and she is evil. But so what Natalie Haynes does is go, well, actually, the origin of that is a lot more complicated and we're not even sure. Let's look at a bunch of different sources and see, was it a jar? Was it a vessel? Why was Pandora there in the first place? Is she bad? And so she kind of walks us through a contemplation of the evidence. And again, like I was saying before, kind of lets us figure it out for ourselves. She definitely gives us her opinions on things. I love that she's not backwards and coming forwards.
No, and she's funny about it too.
She's so
it's not
funny.
dry.
And she'll be snarky in the funniest way. But then, ultimately you are allowed to still like the artwork. I love pre-Raphaelite paintings. I think they're beautiful, but I don't think they're not problematic. So I think that she kind of explores all of that, the complications and the richness of the sources and what we have done to them over the years.
I mean, even she talks about it, a number of paintings where she says Pandora is often painted naked, the temptress, and she says, well, in the earliest tellings of Pandora's jar, she was clothed in a silvery dress or a silvery coat, and yet the men later in history take her clothing off. She becomes a temptress. It's interesting, the archaeological sort of dig that she takes you on to see where did she get intent? When did she start meaning to open the jar? When did she get naked? When did she become a temptress? This sort of thing.
And I think I love that she doesn't try to say, well, that happened in 2000 BCE. She'll explore the different visual media that will show representations of all of the women and go, well, if we interpret this way, these are the kind of conclusions we'll draw. And she goes through with someone like Jocasta, various different playwrights, versions of Jocasta, and how powerful she is and how much she's responsible for events. And it's really interesting that, again, she just kind of goes, there isn't one origin source that we're all trying to come back to. It has always been complicated and a matter that's open to opinion.
Yeah, and I should add, you don't have to know anything really about Greek mythology to enjoy this book. I don't know a great deal about it. I had a wonderful time learning such a lot about not just these myths, but the culture that has grown up around them. They are the building blocks of so much that we know today. And to have someone who knows so much tell me, I really feel the wiser for having read
me
the
too.
book.
And I agree. You don't need to know everything about Greek mythology to enjoy this. She, in a very open, not condescending, just generous way, explains what happened in the story and how their versions have varied. So you immediately get a sense of, Jocasta has to do with the Oedipus story. Okay, gotcha, And some characters are more famous, like Helen or Penelope. But even then, she doesn't assume everybody has read the Odyssey, but would know it in a kind of cultural absorption kind of way. So she'll fill in some blanks, enough that you need to understand what's really important about the women and the role that they played in those stories. And you never feel like you're being talked down to or that this is a teacher giving you a lesson. It's completely really engaging. And I felt like I learned so much reading this too.
Speaking of Helen, I had no idea that she was central to, was it 4 or 5 of the Greek myths? There was
well, yeah, and I guess this is one of the points of her book, is that we accept a version of Helen, which is the filtered product of hundreds of years of imagination. And so we think, oh, Helen, she's the face that launched 1,000 ships. Even that line is something that comes from Marlowe or something, so it's sort of like, so this is something I do. I teach the Odyssey with my third year students, and we look at Helen what I love to do is look at how translators have translated various passages of her over the years. And I think I have got about 6 different examples from about the 1800s to the most recent translation by Emily Wilson, the only woman yet to translate it, and it's brilliant. And to see how they describe Helen, she's either a whore, she is deserving of the punishments she gets. She caused the war in Troy. Or if you look at Emily Wilson's translation, she is much less unforgiving. She shows Helen as somebody who, I wish I had written down the line because it's a genius. It's something like she was the meat that these dogs were fighting over. And that is completely different from saying her wantonness led to the war, that sort of thing. And it allows you to think, okay, maybe she's a lot smarter than we thought. Maybe she didn't run away with Paris. Maybe she was abducted. And it just makes you start to think about everything in a more critical way. And I find that really fascinating. And especially then when you get to characters who are meant to be awful, like Medea or Clytemnestra, who are horrible, but also, she goes, well, why are they horrible? And what has led to this situation?
Why shouldn't they be horrible?
Yeah. And so you kind of go, oh, that's right. Why do I need to just openly accept what I've been fed for my whole life, basically?
So that was Dr. Lisa Bennett talking about Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes.
Fascinating, and makes me think of the Pat Barker book from a couple of years ago called Silence of the Girls, where that's what she's trying to do, is resuscitate the women in the legend of Ulysses.
Penelope.
And give them their own voice and their whole own book.
Yeah, and Penelope is one of the female characters that is covered in Natalie Haynes' book as well.
You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for people who are so addicted to books that they wouldn't go for a walk without one.
Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm in my 50s. I live in Adelaide. What I'm reading at the moment is it's called The Dressmaker's Secret. So this is the book by Rosalie Ham, and it's the follow-up book to The Dressmaker, which some people might remember as the film that starred Kate Winslet and one of the Hemsworth boys. I'm really enjoying reading The Dressmaker's Secret because it's got a lot of fashion and couture. It's set in the 1950s, and it's about the dressmaker, obviously, who's preparing gowns for the society ladies of Melbourne to go to the coronation celebrations for Queen Elizabeth. So it's also sort of mirrors what's going on now with the coronation of the King. I've just finished reading the latest book by John Boyne. It's called All the Broken Places, and it's the follow-up to The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. Yeah, a great book, very thought-provoking. It follows the story of the main character in The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. It follows the story of his sister, and it takes us right up to current days, through the COVID pandemic and so on, and just the burden of living through that history and knowing that her family had a role in what happened to a lot of the Jewish people. So it's very thought-provoking and quite, emotional but enjoyable. I'm not a great person for rereading books, but one book that I have read several times is Stephen King. It's called On Writing. And being a writer, there's a lot of great writing advice in there, but it's also a biography of Stephen King's life, and how he wrote his first book and has become very successful as a, author of horror, I guess, which is not a genre I read at all. But he's very down to earth. He says, well, if you want to write a book, you've got to basically sit in the chair and do it. There's no point sitting around waiting for the muse to show up. You've got to treat it as a job, like any other job. And if you're not sitting at your desk and with your pen and pencil or your computer, then there's a guarantee the muse won't show up. You've got to be ready for it if it's going to happen.
And we'd love to hear from you. If you're keen to share your reading habits and reading past and give us a glimpse of your sundoku, send us a voice memo to sundokukast@gmail.com. That's TSUNDOKU cast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Cath Keneally.
Catch you next time. This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts who are refusing treatment.
Annie Hastwell,
Cath Keneally,
Sarah Martin,
And me, Michaela Andreev.
Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. And if you want to know more about the books, the authors, or the music featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.